Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contracts. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
Ready to level up your Tudor history game? Then don't miss Forging a Queen, Catherine of Aragon Before England. This 6-week online course dives into the fearless life of young Catherine before the crown, before the heartbreak. Led by Dr. Emma, who basically lived in the Spanish archives for a decade and a half, this is not your typical history class. Let's go forge a queen. Visit the show notes to sign up.
This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I'm so happy to welcome back once again, Dr. Elizabeth Norton. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me on. It's a pleasure as always.
I always love having you on the show. You just are such a wealth of knowledge. And this book that you have that just came out really shows how your knowledge expands through time. I don't know how else to explain it, but you have covered 5,000 years of history in one book.
Yes. And I now know an awful lot more about medieval Japan than I ever thought that I would. Which has been fascinating.
I'm so excited to talk about your new book, The Women Who Ruled the World, 5,000 Years of Female Monarchy. But before we get into that, I am also very excited to say that you and I will be at the next Wolf Hall weekend again in June of next year.
Yes, I can't wait. I mean, it's such a pleasure that it's coming back, and also that we'll be coming back because it's so much fun and well worth getting tickets for and coming along to.
Yeah, there's going to be all kinds of different stuff this year going on. Last year, we had it kind of in a more rural setting. This year, we are in London. There's going to be stuff going on at the Tower of London. I think we're going to see a play as well.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's The Mirror and the Light, which is amazing. I mean, I'm really excited because obviously that hasn't been staged for a while. It's going to be fabulous.
Yeah, I can't wait. So if you're interested in checking out the Wolf Hall weekend, I will have a link in the show notes as well. So you can check out all the information, find out who all of the speakers are who will be there, because it's sure to be another exciting weekend of history with friends. So, Elizabeth, let's get started, because I'm looking at your chapter list in front of me, and it's always hard to go, where do we exactly start the conversation? And I think I'm going to start in a little different place, because I am fascinated with Catherine the Great. I don't know much about her other than what I've seen in film and TV series, but you have her under the chapter Snatching the Throne. And I love the name of that chapter, because nothing suits Catherine the Great better than snatching the throne.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely sort of sums up how she became, how this obscure German princess became Empress of Russia. And that's because I was writing about reigning queens, and it's such a pleasure to look at some that weren't sort of, because often they're kind of victims, they are, but not the women in this chapter.
Yeah. For those who aren't familiar with who Catherine the Great was, you kind of hinted at it with her German background a little bit, but why was she so important for you to have in this chapter?
Yeah, so I mean, the Snatching the Throne chapter, because the book is thematic, and I take women from different times and places to kind of look at how, how they kind of accord with the theme, how what they do that's similar, what's different. And Catherine had to go in this chapter, of course. So she is a minor German princess. Her real name is actually Sophie, but when she is baptized into the Orthodox faith, she takes the name Catherine. She's selected to be the wife of the heir to the Russian throne. The Grand Duke Peter, who will later be Tsar Peter III. And she's selected by his aunt, the Empress Elizabeth, who's just this enormous character. She's the daughter of Peter the Great. She takes the throne herself, actually. She sort of walks into the palace one day when there's a baby Tsar and basically says, I'm the Tsar now, off you go to prison. So she's this enormous, larger-than-life character, and she selects Catherine to marry her nephew, who's the heir to the throne. He's actually also German. His mother had been a Russian princess, but actually dies very shortly after his birth. So he was raised in Germany until his aunt takes the throne and brings him back to Russia. And he's very German, doesn't really speak Russian, wears Prussian military dress, isn't very fond of orthodoxy, doesn't really like the Russian people. Whereas Catherine embraces it. She converts to orthodoxy. There's this great letter where she actually writes to her father assuring him that actually orthodoxy is almost exactly the same as Lutheranism, when it's clearly not, is it really? But she learns Russian and learns from Elisaveta. And that's really key. And Elisaveta is a difficult character, she's quite capricious, doesn't always get on with Catherine. There's this great anecdote that I put in the book where one day Catherine's shivering in a really cold church, because, Russia's quite cold in winter. And she sees the Empress call over for a box of fur stoles, and she sees the Empress take out one and put it around her own shoulders. And Catherine sees another one in the box, and she goes, this is great. She's going to send one to me. Yeah. And Elizabeth just has the box closed and sent away. So she's quite a difficult character, but Catherine very much learns from her. When Elisaveta dies, Peter becomes Tsar, and by this stage, the relationship between him and Catherine there's nothing left. They never really get on. He has a mistress. Catherine has lovers. In fact, she's actually pregnant with a child that is not her husband's at the time that Elisaveta dies. She's actually able to give birth in secret by getting one of her servants to set fire to a house on the other side of the city so that Peter goes to watch, and then they smuggle the baby out. But it's clear Peter is planning to divorce her and marry his mistress. And so she basically plots to take the throne. She gets up in the middle of the night, puts on Russian military dress, and goes out into the streets of St. Petersburg and is basically declared Tsar. Really bizarre. It's a bloodless coup. Poor old Peter arrives at one of his fortresses and asks to be let in, says, I'm the emperor, let me in. And one of his military commanders calls out, we don't have an emperor, we've got an empress. And he then fairly promptly dies of hemorrhoids, and hemorrhoids isn't really a fatal condition. So he's possibly the only person who has died of hemorrhoids. I think we can sort of assume there's a bit more to it than that. But Catherine's just, how does she become Empress of Russia? And it's all due to the force of her personality. It's also due to the lack of force in Peter's personality to some extent. But she's this hugely capricious figure. She's an enlightened despot. So, she rules despotically. She rules over a nation of serfs. She's at absolute power. But she's also corresponding with Voltaire. She writes her own autobiographies. And this is really interesting. There are 3 versions of her autobiography. All of them stop before she comes to the throne. It's almost as though she can't quite bring herself to go into the events of that night. But she's just such a huge character. So, she had to be in the book, of course.
Yeah. I have to know, did you watch the TV series The Great?
I've seen a few bits of it. It looks quite good. I need to. It's on my list.
Yeah, it's just
there's a new one out on William the Conqueror, which looks great.
Yes, I want to see that one too. But The Great, it's just so cute and comical. And, as long as you go into it knowing this is probably not historically correct. And it was like after reading your chapter on Catherine the Great here is when I started connecting the dots. I was like, oh, okay, that's what the true history is. It wasn't really how they showed it in The Great, because in The Great, I think it was his aunt was more of just a secondary figure behind the scenes. I don't think in the series she ever claimed any power. She was and then she had like some weird obsession with with Peter the Great, and some weird sexual thing was going on there. So that was like a really strange curveball in the show. After I read your chapter, I was like, that's interesting that they took it that way.
Yeah.
Just always with the
yeah.
women.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's enough going on in the Russian dynasty at that stage, the Romanov dynasty, to kind of, to some extent stick to the facts. I mean, Elizabeth is actually the daughter of two Tsars. She's the daughter of Peter the Great. And then after he dies, he hasn't appointed a successor. So his wife, who is in fact a Lithuanian-born peasant woman who he later marries, becomes Catherine the First of Russia, as you do really, and is, and rules for a couple of years. So I mean, the 18th century in Russia is mostly ruled by women, which is amazing. Although after Catherine's death, her son Paul, who didn't like her, actually changes the succession to ban women from the throne.
Yeah, that's too bad. But he was probably smart in thinking that he was like, well, the women seem to know what they're doing, so let's ban them.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's an element of sort of personal score setting there.
Yes.
Yep. My mother, I don't want another empress.
One of the other chapters, as I'm just like scanning through the list of chapters here, I love some of the chapter titles. One of them that caught my attention, of course, was Monstrous Regiments.
Yes. I mean, that's kind of fairly clearly signposting us to 16th century, the island of Britain, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
John Knox.
Of course, I want to talk about Mary, Queen of Scots, but I also want to bring in some of the other people that you talk about too, because I think that's the cool thing about your book, is it's not just the people we've always heard about. You bring in other names as well. And I love how you bring in Egyptian history, because I feel like so many people are interested in Egyptian history, but we don't know much about it. So when it comes to monstrous regiments, I'm going to let you decide. Do you want to talk about Mary, Queen of Scots, or do you want to talk about one of the two other women that you had included in that one?
I mean, they're kind of strangely interlinked, and that was what I was trying to bring out, is that the three featured queens in that chapter, and every chapter has some featured queens, and then there are obviously other secondary figures, but this one is obviously Mary, Queen of Scots, also Arsinoe the Fourth of Egypt, and also Atalia of Judah, who is a biblical queen. And that was quite interesting to look at. She's the only reigning queen in the Old Testament, actually. And of course, the Old Testament, I think most of us have moved away from viewing it as an entirely kind of historical source, but there is history in there. And actually, what I was particularly interested in Atalia, she's probably Jezebel's daughter. She's certainly a close relative of Jezebel, the infamous queen consort of Israel. But actually, what I was interested in, particularly with Atalia and also Jezebel, sort of through her, was how they used kind of to castigate later queens. There are a lot of comparisons of Mary, Queen of Scots, to Atalia or to Jezebel. Mary the First of England gets called a Jezebel quite a bit by hostile writers. And basically, they're looking for the biblical precedent to really stamp on these queens and, try and put them back into their place. Both Jezebel and Atalia have horrible ends. Jezebel gets thrown out of a window after an invasion of Israel. Atalia actually, she basically takes the throne after the murder of her son, and not by her, actually, in this case. Sometimes the queens are involved in the murders of their own children, but this one, she's not. But she takes the throne, and eventually there's sort of a palace coup, and she actually gets, sort of stabbed to death on the steps of the temple. So she's basically seen as a queen who deserved it, who got what was coming to her. And you can see that in the other queens in the chapter. I mean, Mary, Queen of Scots, her story is really well known. But there is a sense in the English sources and some of the Scottish sources that frankly she had it coming. And they do use Atalia, but they also make comparisons to Cleopatra. And so I was quite keen to bring in Arsinoe the Fourth, who is Cleopatra's younger sister and much less well known than her older sister. But she actually sort of rebels against Cleopatra and briefly reigns in Egypt before being removed from the throne and taken to Rome, where she's paraded through the streets in a victory parade. And actually, it doesn't have the desired effect. Cleopatra's actually there while the victory parade goes on, but it doesn't have the desired effects. Actually, people feel really sorry for Arsinoe, which is unusual. She looks really pitiable. She's then sent off to a temple in Ephesus to go and live out the rest of her life, and later gets murdered by Mark Antony. And Cleopatra's blamed for the murder, of course. But I was quite keen to bring these queens together and to tell their story because you do get the parallels. Shakespeare very much parallels Cleopatra and Elizabeth I. I mean, Antony and Cleopatra, there are lots of references to Cleopatra that look very like Elizabeth I. He's clearly drawing on what he knew about a reigning queen, which kind of means that Mary is Arsinoe, of course, and, the kind of the victim queen, the queen that doesn't succeed, the failure queen. And that's interesting. And there are the explicit comparisons, particularly to Italia in Mary, Queen of Scots' case. So what I was really looking at was, attitudes to women in the 16th century. We've got the monstrous regiment of John Knox, where women are just dreadful and they can't have governance over men, and looking at how they bring in historical or biblical precedents, because I think it is really interesting because reigning queens have always been somewhat rare. I mean, I've found lots of examples, but they're somewhat rare compared to kings particularly. Actually, people do look back for historical precedent, and often they really go for the negative examples.
Of course they do. Of course they do. One of my favorite things, like I love talking about women in history. It's my favorite thing to do. We love women in history who have power, but there's nothing I love more than a warrior queen. And of course, when I think of warrior queens, the first one that I think of is Isabel I of Castile. Yes. Let's talk about warrior queens and how you chose the people for this chapter, because I don't even know how you'd go about choosing for this one.
Yeah, I mean, so there could have been lots, I mean, there are a lot of women that kind of have a reputation as warrior queens because in some respects it's the acceptable face of queenship, that they kind of construct themselves almost as kind of men, a bit like Elizabeth I with her, body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. Actually, rulers are supposed to be militaristic, at least in the sort of pre-modern period. And actually the women kind of buying into that to some extent, it's an acceptable face of monarchy, although it can be quite difficult to balance, particularly as most of the women, of course, haven't had any military training. So the queens I picked for this book, I wanted to get quite a wide spread. And it was really important in the book that I didn't just end up kind of looking at Europe and North Africa. I wanted to kind of widen out to look at the rest of the world. Because actually, if you're looking at queenship, queenship doesn't start in Europe, of course. It starts in Africa. The earliest known queen is Mernith, who is a first dynasty pharaoh, for example. So I wanted to broaden it out. So we've got Isabel, of course. Also Juana la Beltranea, who's her niece, well, probably her niece. Isabel would have debated that, who is really the rightful Queen of Castile, and actually Isabel takes the throne from Juana in the War of the Castilian Succession. It's really confusing because, of course, there are two Juanas. There's Juana la Beltranea, who's the daughter of Henry IV or Enrico IV of Castile, and then there's Juana la Loca, who is the daughter of Isabel, of course. Also in the chapter, I've got Zenobia, who is Queen of Palmyra and actually conquers Egypt briefly in the Roman period. Is to some extent kind of the closest thing we have to a reigning empress in Rome. She uses Roman titles. She calls herself Augusta, but really powerful woman, and kind of doesn't. Isn't born to a throne, kind of builds herself up. And she's really interesting. And then finally, I've got the Queens of Kush or the Queens of Meroe in Sudan. If you go to Meroe today, and it's quite difficult to get there because it's in Sudan, they've got this wonderful kind of like pyramid field. There's more pyramids than there are in Egypt. And there are these really tall pyramids, really steep angles. And, most of these actually commemorate women. They commemorate the Queens of Kush. And in the book, most societies don't really want reigning queens. And that's kind of almost a given across the book. They tend to be last resorts. But actually in Kush, they're quite keen on having reigning queens. It's a rare example of a society that actually wants women in power. And they're really, really powerful. We have a whole series of reigning queens, sort of in the last centuries BCE and the first century CE, doing remarkable things. And they're very militaristic. If you go to the British Museum today, there's this wonderful wall relief that they've actually hacked off the wall of one of these pyramids. But it shows one of the Kandakes. So they're the queens of Kush, sitting, looking absolutely, huge woman. She's kind of standing on the feet of her prisoners and looking incredibly powerful. And so they're fascinating. And actually, one of the main reasons the Romans don't end up extending their empire further into Africa is because of the Candaces. They rebel against Rome. They go to war with them, and actually, eventually, the Rome kind of settles with them, says, right, we won't go any further south. So they're really powerful. So all of these figures are really disparate. Zenobia is around the same time as the Candaces, but Isabel and, of course, Juana la Beltranea are miles in the future. But actually, I think, a lot of what they're up against kind of holds true. How you construct yourself as a queen and a warrior, how you deal with the military side of rule, because it's really important to a ruler to be able to do that. I mean, Isabel doesn't fight, of course. Neither does Juana la Beltranea, neither does Zenobia, because, they haven't been trained, but they're still military commanders. And it's fascinating. And it's also fascinating to look at ideas of warrior queens, because, of course, it's quite a popular motif today. I mean, you often get kind of the barbarian queen in kind of like a metal bikini breastplate, which is rubbish, of course, because you'll just stab them in the stomach. I mean, who wants a bikini in battle? But, but it's kind of that sense. It's interesting at how they construct it. And Isabel is so good at propaganda, particularly in kind of really constructing herself as the rightful Queen of Castile and, in everything she does. And a lot of her reputation is really negative, of course. She expels the Jewish people from Castile. She conquers the Muslim kingdom of Granada and, commits real atrocities. She brings in the Spanish Inquisition, which again is dreadful. But she's actually really good at kind of spinning all of this into a positive thing. And there's still a campaign for her canonization today. I suspect, given her religious intolerance, she'll never quite get there. But, who knows?
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
Yeah, she is one of those figures from history, isn't she? we always want to compare Catherine of Aragon to her, like she would have been the same as her mother. And I don't know, do you agree if Catherine had been left unchecked, would she have become another Isabel?
It's difficult. What's really sad with Isabel is none of her children have happy lives. Catherine of Aragon probably has the happiest life of any of her siblings, and look what happens to her. But actually, and again, Isabel loves her children, but she uses them as pawns. She'll happily send Catherine off to England and never to see her again. She forces her eldest daughter to remarry after she's been widowed, even when she wants to become a nun, and just things like that. So I don't know. I think they clearly are devoted to Isabel. Catherine clearly reveres her memory. Is devoted to her. But I don't know. I kind of think there's no softer side to Isabella, if you know what I mean. She's very, very driven. She takes the throne. She's not really the legitimate Queen of Castile at all. That's poor old Juana la Beltranea. But, she's just so driven, and she's really driven by her religious purpose, and she just thinks she's absolutely in the right. And I think Catherine is a little more able to see other points of view to some extent. So I kind of think, I'm not sure she would have followed her mother as much, but certainly she sees her as a revered figure and someone that is a clear example that women can reign. And that's really important for Catherine of Aragon, of course, because she has Mary. She knows that women can be great queens. She's seen it.
Yeah, I always think of the Battle of Flodden, right? And seeing that as Catherine's similarities with Isabel, how Catherine was like, I wanted to send you his whole bloody body, but they advised against it.
Isabel would have sent the body, undoubtedly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They're powerful women, and Catherine's raised with Isabel. She's raised really close to Isabel. She's probably, apart from Isabel's eldest daughter, is another Isabel. Catherine's probably her sort of closest of her daughters. She's certainly quite sad to see her go when she goes to England, but I think she does learn a lot from her mother.
Yeah, I think so too. I want to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to make a confession on the show, and I hope people don't judge me too much for this. I am an American, obviously, but I only recently discovered that there had been a monarch in Hawaii, and that the Americans are the ones that basically went in and kicked her out. Can we talk about this? Because I feel like so many Americans have no idea that this happened.
Yeah, you're the bad guys here, and as a British person, it's normally us.
You're like, thank you.
I mean, actually, the British do accidentally colonize Hawaii for a few months in the 19th century when a ship's captain overreaches himself and goes in and writes, right, you're a British colony. And when word gets to Britain, and they go, no, we haven't. Take the flag down. But yeah, no, you guys actually do colonize Hawaii. It's quite a sad story, actually. It's a really interesting figure. So the final monarch of Hawaii is Liliuokalani, who is a fascinating figure. Very, very well educated. She's raised in what's known as the Royal School, where they learn Hawaiian traditions, Hawaiian language, but also English and kind of politics. They're being kind of bred to rule effectively. And she lives this life that's both very traditional but also very westernized. She marries an American, actually, and actually faces quite a lot of prejudice in her own home, mainly from her mother-in-law, actually, in spite of the fact that Liliuokalani is a princess, whereas her husband very much is not a prince, and that's quite interesting. But she translates Hawaiian works into English, important text. She actually writes the Hawaiian national anthem while she's crown princess as well. Before that, they'd used God Save the King. But she writes the own anthem. So she's very patriotic, very, very proud. And Hawaii has this, very established system of monarchy. They've had monarchs for centuries. Her brother becomes king, Kalakaua, and doesn't do particularly well. Hawaii is at that point central to the sugar trade. Much of the sugar being imported into the US is coming from Hawaii at that stage. There are a lot of particularly American settlers, although there is also contact with Japan and with Britain as well. And there is a sense that actually the American settlers are very much trying to take over. And there's a sense of kind of belittling them a little. Mark Twain actually visits Hawaii and is actually incredibly rude about the royal family. He talks about their playhouse kingdom and how, they've got sort of these grand titles, Commander of the Royal Guard, and then there's 6 guardsmen and things like that. It's very much on British lines, the royal family. And there's been a lot of contact. Kalakaua comes to Britain. Also, they go to America quite regularly. Liliuokalani is friends with Grover Cleveland, actually, which helps her a little bit later on, but not too much. So she becomes. Her brother is forced while she's actually in Britain for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. And it's really nice to actually have an example where 2 queens meet. I like that. But while she's in Britain, Kalakaua is forced to agree to what's known as the Bayonet Constitution by the American settlers, which is basically kind of takes power from the monarch and places it in the hands of the settlers. It reduces the amount of sort of residency requirements you need to be able to vote in Hawaiian affairs and things like that. So it's a bit of a takeover. They're really unhappy about it. And actually, while Kalakaua is off in America trying to kind of get this sorted out, he actually dies, and Liliuokalani becomes Queen of Hawaii. And she's much more independent than I think the settlers were hoping for. She refuses to follow the Bayonet Constitution on her first day in office. She basically says, nope, I'm doing my own thing. And we've got her handwritten drafts of a new constitution. And it's very much on US lines. She's clearly studied the US Constitution and is effectively kind of molding it for Hawaii. But this looks alarmingly independent as far as, particularly sort of the vested interests are concerned. And eventually she's deposed and imprisoned and spends more than a year actually imprisoned in her palace. where she does a lot of writing. She writes a lot of letters. There's letters to Queen Victoria, to Grover Cleveland, to Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany. Anyone she knows, she writes to and is saying, can you help me? This is the point really where basically there's a US Navy ship in the vicinity when she's deposed, and troops come off the ship and sort of take over the country. So it takes a bit of time before it is officially part of the US, but she's basically fighting a losing cause. She goes to Washington for quite some time to try and argue her case, but she's never getting her kingdom back. So it's quite a sad story. I mean, it is a sad story, and there is still quite, on the 100th anniversary of her deposition, for example, people marched on the Iolani Palace in Honolulu, where she'd been deposed, as kind of say, actually we want Hawaiian independence. I don't think they're going to get it, but yeah, I mean, it's one of those. It's an important story, I think, and I think what's really interesting is that, in some respects, her independence actually was her downfall. If she'd been a more compliant monarch, she probably would have been left where she was. But because she was so determined to secure her independence, actually, she ended up losing her kingdom. She writes to Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria sends her back this letter saying, yeah, I'm really sorry. That sounds absolutely awful. Not a lot I can do, I'm afraid, But I mean, a lot of these stories are sad stories. And that was the thing that struck me, actually, and I think is important to say really about the book, is actually a lot of these stories don't have happy endings at all. It's much more likely you'll fail as a reigning queen than you'll succeed. We've got so many more Mary Queen of Scots than we've got Elizabeth I, for example. But I think the fact that they try and they do it is really important. And Liliuokalani is such an important figure in Hawaiian history. And I think for, people of Hawaiian descent, I think she's a really important figure as well. And also people that live in Hawaii, people who have moved, or people of American descent. Actually, I think it's really important, that they do have this this historic figure. And it's, of course, the only part of the US that has a royal palace that you can go and visit today.
Yes, and that's the only
cool,
that's the only reason why I learned about this, because I had some friends who went to Hawaii last summer, and they were sending me pictures going, did you know that there was a queen who ruled? We're at the palace right now, and they're sending me pictures, and I was like, I had no idea. This is not something that they teach in school. They do not talk about this in history classes. We focus on like all the wars. We don't look at what we necessarily conquered as Americans, because I think that would have been an interesting story to teach us.
Yeah, I mean, it happened. It happened. A lot of bad stuff, of course, was done in the 18th, 19th centuries. And there are also, of course, positives from it, but yeah, I mean, it's one of those stories. I think it is important that people know about it. I think it's important for the people of Hawaii that it's widely known. And, that's not in any way to sort of suggest that, they shouldn't be part of the US, because they've obviously been in the US for a very long time. But I think knowing the history is important. It always surprised me a bit that the Union Jack is on the Hawaiian state flag. And actually, whenever I see the state flags sort of flying, I was in DC earlier in the year and they're all flying. It's like, oh, look, there's a Hawaiian one. I mean, they weren't really a colony. I mean, it's a British colony. It's a bit random. It's on there anyway, to be honest.
Yeah, I didn't even know that. That's an interesting.
It's a little piece of Britishness that's just snuck its way back into the US.
Yeah. It's almost like it's like a little thumb at the US. Like, yeah, look at this. Look at our flag.
Yeah.
I'm curious. You covered so many women in this book. Is there anyone that maybe stands out the most to you, like when you were doing your research and you were like, oh, I definitely want to talk about this person?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many, and some I really, really liked and thought, you're fascinating. Some were quite difficult to research. Terry Emma Veru of Bora Bora, and she's only a 19th century queen, but actually there wasn't a huge amount on her to be found, really. I used a lot of kind of obituaries and newspaper reports. But I think the one that most stands out to me, and I think in some respects her whole life kind of epitomizes what it's always been to be a reigning queen, is Tamar of Georgia. Tamar the Great, who is a medieval queen in Georgia, which the kingdom on the kind of borders of, well, the country on the borders of Europe and Asia. she's such a fascinating figure, and she's not very well known in the West, of course. In Georgia, she's hugely well known. She's on the currency. She's their once and future queen, a bit like King Arthur. So they have this myth that she is sleeping. She's not dead. She's sleeping in a cave, and one day she'll rise up to rule Georgia once again. But actually, her story was one. She wasn't welcomed at all. She was crowned as queen actually as king. A lot of the Eastern queens particularly are crowned as kings or female kings. And in some respects, I think the term female king works better for them because it explains, what the role is and differentiates them from consorts. But so she's crowned as king of Georgia alongside during her father's reign. So her father's basically saying, I want you to be my heir. I don't have any sons, so I'm going to crown you as king, and then people will just have to follow you when I die. And he's quite scary, her father. He'd previously blinded his nephew to ensure that Tamar could succeed. So people would go, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely. But of course, as soon as he dies, they go, don't really want a queen. Queens aren't great, we'd rather have a king. And she really struggles. She has years early in her reign of just it being an absolute nightmare. She has a bit of a Magna Carta moment where some of her rebellious nobles attempt to impose effectively a constitution on her, to create a building that's very much like a parliament building, where she kind of, she actually said it would be the end of her reign if she had to follow this, which I think is true. She's able to water it down, but she's not able to entirely to push back against this, and it takes her some time. She also is forced to marry this sort of slightly random Russian prince that they find and send off for, and discover he's a bit of a nightmare as well. Eventually, she's in a strong enough position where she's able to divorce her husband. She then defeats him militarily. She's able to appoint her own government. And she also marries a husband who's quite happy to just be given an army and told where to march, really, and doesn't have very much political interest. So she kind of gradually builds up power. And it kind of culminates in she's attacked by one of the neighbouring sultanates, and actually there's this really offensive letter that the Sultan writes to her saying he wants to put her in his harem and that women shouldn't be in power. And she defeats him, and it's kind of this real high point in Georgian culture. She controls the most land that Georgia had hitherto had. It's a moment, before the Mongolian invaders and Mongol invaders will come in the next generation and sort of conquer Georgia. So actually, it's kind of almost their kind of last hurrah, the last kind of moment of gloriousness. And she's remembered as this really, really powerful, really important queen. But actually, if you look at the start of her life, it's so difficult to get to that point. And I think that really sums up reigning queens. Almost nothing's handed to them on a plate. And up to really the 20th century, they have to fight for what they have. We can see that with Elizabeth I. She's quite lucky she doesn't have any male relatives, because had she had some male relatives, I think she may have struggled to become queen. But even then, there's constant complaints about the queen being female, and people just they do have to fight for what they have. And I think Tamar is so representative. She's a fascinating figure. It was fascinating to delve into Georgian history, and the language is an absolute nightmare for an English speaker. It's related to no current language, so it's you sort of in fact I'm recording the audiobook in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to have to phonetically write out all the Georgian and practice it, because it's very, very hard if you're not a native Georgian speaker. But fabulous.
There's nothing more difficult than having to speak a language and names that you are unfamiliar with. Like, that is probably the one thing I struggle with the most as a podcaster, is saying the names correctly. How do you know 100% that you are saying a name correctly?
So I basically research. So I'll go on YouTube and kind of look at videos from the actual country and try and get a sense. And like, if everyone's calling them Tamar rather than Tamar, I'm going to go with Tamar. But
yeah,
actually, yeah. But no, I mean, it is difficult because you read it and these names aren't very familiar. Often they're ancient names, or they're names from different parts of the world. I mean, it's part of the fun of it. But yeah, I was really keen actually in the book to spell the names as they themselves used. So actually, a lot of the spellings are sort of unfamiliar to English speakers, because I've deliberately tried to use the names that they knew. So Catherine the First of Russia is Ekaterina. Elizabeth of Russia is Elizaveta, for example. Yeah. Catherine the Great is still Catherine the Great. She's in Russian, of course, she is Katerina, but she's so widely known as Catherine the Great. And also, of course, she's German, and she actually signed her own name as Catherine. So I kind of there are a few where they were too well known to change it really.
Yeah.
But I think it is important to try and use the names that they use themselves.
Yeah, I like that. I really do. I noticed that while I was reading the book that you had done that, and I really enjoyed that. One of the
Yeah,
other. Oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry, and also it helps differentiate them a little bit as well, which is helpful too. But I think it's a really good thing, and I think we should try not to anglicize names because it's taking away something of their identity.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great point. When you're talking about medieval queens and ancient queens, my mind immediately goes to what's the example in England at that time, right? So you're talking about
Yeah,
Tamar, right? Is that how you pronounced it?
yeah. Mhm.
And how she was medieval. What was the date range again with her, and who was ruling in England at the time? I'm always curious to look at those parallels.
Yeah, so she's late 12th century to early 13th. So it's basically sort of Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, King John. Although her Magna Carta moment is a little bit before King John's, it's kind of almost a precursor, except for I suspect the English barons hadn't heard of anything from Georgia.
I just love to look at the differences. Here we have Georgia and here we have England, and Georgia has a female ruler, and England had already pushed aside Empress Matilda as an option for
Yeah.
queen. Oh, yeah. I love looking at the world as a whole when it comes to that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Tamar's quite fortunate in that there isn't another male candidate. And you do see this actually. There's a chapter in the book called the male relative problem, and they are
Yeah.
problems in general. If you have a male relative, you may find that you're not going to be reigning as queen for very long or very independently. Tamar doesn't have a male relative, so they kind of have to hold her on the throne a bit. They might try and take the power from her, but there's nobody else. Empress Matilda, unfortunately, of course, has Stephen, her cousin, who whizzes over to England and takes the crown. That's kind of a problem for them. Mary Queen of Scots, again, actually, she creates her own problem by giving birth to James because, of course, most people would rather have a king, even if it's a baby king, than a queen. She's kind of fulfilled her point by giving birth. So, great for her on a personal level. She's had a lovely baby, but terrible on a political level. And actually, that's something Elizabeth I very much recognizes, I think, when she refuses to marry.
Yeah. Elizabeth I. I feel like we talk about her so much on this show, and I like how you had mentioned, how she basically had other female heirs around her. Because we just recently talked, I don't remember who I was discussing this with, but how it was just women everywhere around Elizabeth. She really, what was she to do?
Yeah.
And then she ends up with James, One of the other things.
I mean, she's fairly horrible to her female relatives. I mean, you don't want to have a claim to the throne and be her cousin, to be honest.
No, nobody was safe. But but also in Elizabeth's defense, she wanted to be able to leave the country in capable hands, and clearly there was something about her female cousins she didn't like.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think there would have been civil war. Elizabeth had smallpox in 1562, and I think there probably would have been civil war if she died at that point, because I would suspect the English would try and crown Catherine Grey. But of course, Mary, Queen of Scots, has a much better claim to the throne than Catherine Grey, and French backing and Scottish backing. So, actually, and Catholic backing in England. So I think it would have been a really difficult situation. Elizabeth's decision not to marry is great for Elizabeth because she's got no rival. They've got to kind of back her, but terrible for the dynasty. And it's really only fortunate that she lived so long and she kind of outlived all of the debate, really, that actually it all comes good in the end. But it was a bit of a disaster, the succession, for a long time in her reign.
Yeah, it definitely was. I think the way I want to end this interview today, because I always want to be able to leave something for the readers, right? Because your book is out in the UK right now, right? But it doesn't come out in the US.
4th of September and US in October. Yeah, so not too late.
I don't want to reveal too much of the book before it comes out because it is a fantastic book. But I think the last thing I want to ask you about is, how do you see that queenship changed from the ancient queens to Queen Elizabeth II?
That's a great question. In some respects, it stays quite similar. The idea. I mean, even Elizabeth II, there had been doubts about crowning another queen. It wasn't ideal that she was female, and also she was heiress presumptive right up until the day of her succession, because you never know, her father might have a boy. It was pretty unlikely, but so even then, she's not exactly welcomed. But things have changed, of course. By the 19th century, it's a lot easier to be a queen. You're much less likely to find that you get usurped or, kind of marginalized. I mean, even in the 18th century, Maria Theresa really struggled to secure the Habsburg inheritance. I mean, by a struggle, there was a full-on war that involved Europe and also North America. I mean, a massive, massive war, all because she was a woman. Whereas if she'd been, instead of Maria Theresa, if she'd been Charles August or something, she would have just had everything. There would have been no war. So things do change in the 19th century. There were concerns about Queen Victoria, but there was never a suggestion that you would step over her. They looked at the family tree and they went, yep, she's next in line. And that was just how it was. So things had really changed. But there's still a sense that women in the 19th century aren't necessarily as capable. I mean, Queen Victoria gets very usurped by Prince Albert. I mean, I know she loved him dearly, but he wasn't the most supportive of kind of political spouses. He very much kind of took over. It was good for her later reign, I think, that he wasn't around, but probably not good for her personally. She was a bit upset. But yeah, I mean, and that's putting it mildly, really.
Yeah.
But I think, Elizabeth II, there was obviously never any question that she would reign, which her medieval predecessors had very much faced, and her ancient predecessors. But there was still, she's always the only woman in the room in the early photos. When you see her with Commonwealth leaders or other world leaders, there's always her in her ball gown and then everyone else in their suits. There'd never been an elected head of government, so a prime minister, by the time she became queen. The first in 1960 in Sri Lanka, it was then Ceylon. There'd never been an elected head of state, so a president. Actually, I mean, in the book, I really focus on heads of state because I think, they don't have anyone to hide behind. And actually, the very first person first woman directly elected to a presidency. So Isabel Perón is a little earlier in Argentina, but she gets promoted from vice president. But the first woman elected is in Iceland in 1980, which is only 45 years ago. She's still alive. The first man to be elected as head of state is not still alive and hasn't been alive for a very, very, very long time. So I think, actually times changed during Elizabeth II's reign, but I think very much at the start, actually all of the examples of female power that she would have been familiar with are basically reigning queens, some powerful consorts and regents as well. And it's very much, I think she would recognise a lot of her role in the queens that have gone before her. They have different circumstances, they have different languages, they have different worldviews, but actually they still face, they're not exactly welcome. Disparagement, what do you do with their husbands, things like that. And, the same issues come up time and again. I mean, even Margareta II of Denmark, had marital conflict with her husband over his role. I mean, there's this joint tomb has been built for her and Prince Hendrik in Roskilde Cathedral, which is currently covered up, but he won't be buried there. He died a few years ago and said that he wouldn't be buried there unless, at least according to reports, unless she made him a king. So even in the 21st century, there are issues for reigning queens. So yes, it's changed. It's certainly in the 21st century, we're going to see a lot more queens because succession rules in Europe, at least, have mostly been changed to allow women to have equal inheritance rights. But I think they should look back at their predecessors. And I think every queen who attempts to reign, even if they fail, has kind of added something to it because they're showing that women can potentially have political power. So I think if we want to think about women in power, we've got to look at the reigning queens.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, what a perfect note to end on. I can't even come up with a better way to end our conversation today. Unless there is a final note that you would like to leave with the listeners. Is there anything that we overlooked that you want to make sure that we cover?
No, I'm just, read my book. I would love you to read my book. It was so much fun to research and write, but also I think it's really important. I mean, we live in a world where women are still held to higher standards than men in many respects. We live in a world where it's still quite difficult for women to be elected to office. I would say in general, there are higher bars for them in many respects. So I think actually female power is ancient. It goes back 5,000 years, but it's also quite fragile. And, I think it's worth researching the history and, and kind of trying to pay it forward, if you like.
Yes, exactly. Dr. Elizabeth Norton, thank you so much for coming on the show again today to talk about the women who ruled the world, 5,000 years of female monarchy. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.
Already trading stocks or options? Now it's time to explore the power of futures. EdgeClear is the forward-thinking futures broker built to help active traders like you hit the ground running. With expert guidance, intuitive platforms, and a personalized touch, we'll make your transition to futures smooth and strategic. Trade with precision, power, and purpose. Start your futures journey at edgeclear.com/Spotify. Disclaimer: derivatives trading is not suitable for all investors.
Every minute your finance team spends wrestling with data is a minute lost. Insight Software's AI-powered insights instantly move you from complexity to clarity. Automated analysis, real-time reporting, strategic recommendations, all at your fingertips. Transform how your finance team works and watch your business grow. Stop wasting time. Start making smarter decisions. Learn more at insightsoftware.com/AI.